Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. This is the Fast Friday edition of the show for December 11th, 2020. And whenever we report on states getting, we'll say, a little uppity and considering legislation to undermine a federal program, one of the most common pieces of opposition, one of the most common objections goes like this. And we get two versions of the same thing. First of all, from people who oppose the action in the states, they'll just basically say something like, you really need to drop this issue. The feds are just going to come in and take away all their federal highway funding, and then it's going to be case closed. The thing's going to be done. On the other hand, supporters will often say, I really like what you guys are talking about here, but unfortunately, even if you get this passed, the feds are going to come in and they're going to march in and take away all their federal highway funding, and it's going to be case closed, everything's done. But that's actually not what happens in practice. I think it's more fear-mongering and misinformation than anything. And today, I'm going to briefly cover two Supreme Court opinions that tell me it's really unlikely that it's going to start happening anytime soon. But first of all, before getting to that, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. Our show homepage has everything you need to follow this program. All the archives for over 2 years. On individual episodes, I have singular posts for each episode where I link to a lot of the stuff that I reference. So you can read and research and learn more on your own time. You can find all the platforms, video, live, archive, audio-only podcast edition. Thank you to all the people who've been leaving reviews on Apple and elsewhere. It really, really helps us spread the word. And you can also find our membership program where you can support us for as little as $2 a month, and we make it go a long, long way in support of the Constitution and liberty. That show homepage is 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. It's all spelled out. 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And it couldn't be more grateful for you spending some of your time with me today. Thank you so much for being here, whether it's your first time or you've been here for every single episode since I started. I really, really appreciate it. But since it's Fast Friday, I promise to not take up too much of your time. Let's see if I can get this information out to you in the next 10 to 15 minutes. I'm going to first start out with an example. This was from a tweet by a pretty prominent conservative commentator a couple of years ago, and he put it this way. If sanctuary states, he's talking about immigration sanctuary states, are unwilling to cooperate with federal law, the president should strip them of federal highway funds, which would have a great impact. Refer to South Dakota versus Dole. So the claim here is that if the immigration sanctuaries, or any type of sanctuary, we could put that for gun sanctuaries, healthcare sanctuaries, whatever we want to call them, the precedent or the notion would be that the executive branch on their own could literally say, you aren't participating in the enforcement of this federal program, this federal act, and because of that, we're going to take away, for example, all of your highway funds. And then this, of course, would coerce the states into getting the job done. And they're citing South Dakota versus Dole, claiming that there's a Supreme Court precedent to back this up. Another example would be, let's think of something that's been talked about more recently, a mask mandate. Here from Congressional Research Service via lawandcrime.com, they're talking about trying to get one of these enforced in practice. And they say, in general, this is a CRS, in general, enforcing these mandates has been a challenge even for states, which can leverage their state and local law enforcement apparatus to enforce them, typically through ticketing and fines. But this general enforcement apparatus, however, is not available to the federal government, which lacks states' general police power and cannot commandeer state officers to carry out federal directives. Two quick points on that. General police power, the idea of having a broad swath or range of powers. This is primarily discussed by James Madison, Federalist 45. When he was arguing in support of ratification, he was talking about how the proposed Constitution delegated to the federal government a set of powers that were few and defined, and he said that those reserved to the state governments were numerous and indefinite. That numerous and indefinite, that is the general police power, is what we would call it more often today. And then commandeering, for those of you who have followed our work here, are very familiar with anti-commandeering, again, based on James Madison. in Federalist 46, where he advised that states and individuals, and political subdivisions, of course, of states, use a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union as an effective strategy to bring down federal programs. So Madison said you can do this whether you think the federal act is unconstitutional or just bad policy. Now, surprisingly, the Supreme Court has actually backed this up time and time again from 1842 and as recently as 2018 in something called the Anti-commandeering doctrine. I'm not going to get into really a lot of detail on that. I just want to briefly point that out because CRS talked about commandeering. The basic notion is that the Congress, the federal government, cannot tell a state that they have to start or stop doing anything to help implement or effectuate a federal regulatory program, federal act or regulatory program. That would be commandeering, like a pirate. So what's the next step for a mask mandate, for example? Here at Law and Crime, they're basically saying the president could request a legislative plan from Congress, which effectively coerces states into enacting the mandate in much the same way that successive U.S. administrations conditioned federal highway funding on the states, instituting more restrictive drinking laws during the 1980s. And this is the fable, the idea that the federal government went to the states and said, you have to raise the drinking age or you're going to lose all your federal highway funding. And a lot of people believe that's how it happened. Now, it's similar to that, but that's not exactly the case. And some of the specifics really change the outcome of how this all plays out in practice. Here from an article I wrote back in 2018, we're talking really what went to the Supreme Court was South Dakota versus Dole in 1987. This was a case where the court considered how much pressure, and we're talking about financial pressure, the federal government could put on the states. In 1984, Congress passed the National Minimum Drinking Age Act, withholding 5% of federal highway funds from states that didn't raise their drinking age to 21 in the first year and 10% per year thereafter. Now, you already are starting to see the difference between the established story, which is even repeated here at Law and Crime. The federal government said we're going to condition federal highway funding unless you raise your drinking age. Well, what they really did was we're going to condition a small sliver of federal highway funding. Now, South Dakota challenged, and they wanted to get the whole law thrown out, but they lost in court. And here I wrote again, although the Supreme Court upheld the federal law, it came with some pretty specific limitations. One was a requirement that the amount of funding could be seen only as an inducement and not be, quote, so coercive as to pass the point at which pressure turns into compulsion. They can basically say, you've got an incentive, you're going to get an extra 5 points, an extra 10% on this, or you're going to be able to keep things as they are, or you're going to lose 10% if you don't follow. But if it goes much more than that, it really is a gray area. Unfortunately, I wish we had an actual real line in the sand, and maybe we weren't even be talking about these unconstitutional federal funding programs in the first place. But the fact that they exist, and in practice, in modern jurisprudence, there is some kind of a gray area line in the sand. In this case, I wrote, a withholding of 5% was below the threshold, as the court noted this, quote, constituted less than half of 1% of South Dakota's budget at the time. I would love to see every state cut at least a 0.5% from their budget. And if they had to do it to opt out of a federal program, that would actually be a net gain, at least a small one. Additionally, I wrote, the court has held that funding conditions on the states must be reasonably related. Again, a gray area, but for example, taking away a law enforcement grant over a refusal to enforce an environmental regulation. We know that state departments of environment really are the ones doing most of the enforcement or implementation or checking on the regulations of the EPA, for the EPA. So taking away a law enforcement grant over not participating in environment would likely be considered unrelated. I'm certain of it, but we can't prove it. Considered unrelated and unconstitutional. Now, here back to CRS, this was published, I believe, in August of this year, talking about this type of a mass mandate idea. They're basically saying Congress could incentivize the states to do this. Of course, they take a very broad view of general welfare, and they would say, you know, even this thought, like, even if they can do it, if they can find a way to make this fit into general welfare, they can actually pressure the states. But there are still some limitations. Of course, I don't think it even gets past that first stage when we're talking about the original legal meaning of the Constitution from the founders and ratifiers. But even here, these big government people are saying, one, Congress needs to provide clear notice of the mandate that states must enact. Two, it has to be related to the purpose of the federal funds. So the funds can't be already going to, let's say, like a counterterrorism or a border control or environmental regulation, something like that. This is totally and obviously unrelated if they're trying to condition those types of funds that were stolen in the first place from the people and then kind of cycled through the system. But they're unrelated. Number three, the conditional grant of funds cannot otherwise be barred by the Constitution. I think in almost every situation, number three, they don't actually pass, but to them, they're always going to succeed on that part. And number four, the amount of federal funds offered is, and you're going to recognize this from just a few minutes ago, is not so coercive as to pass the point at which pressure turns into compulsion. Again, that's citing the 1987 South Dakota versus Dole case. So the idea that South Dakota versus Dole actually supports the notion of yanking all federal highway funds over sanctuary cities or a mask mandate or something is really pretty absurd. Here's Josh Blackman over at Reason. He's a great legal scholar, does a lot of really good work. I don't have to agree with him on everything, but I think he's really a good writer. He said Congress could bribe the states to use their own police power. So long as the amount withheld is non-coercive per NFIB, this approach would likely be constitutional. But in order to stay non-coercive, the amount that they're bribing, first of all, I want to point out that none of these things are really constitutional by the original legal meaning. But if we're talking about just how is it going to play out in court, they're going to see them all as a constitutional exercise of power. But then is the funding coercive? And that coercive amount can't be that high. Now, he's talking about NFIB. This is National Federation of Independent Business versus Sibelius, the 2012 Obamacare case. Here I wrote the court cited Dole. They went back to 1987 and they talked about this coercion principle. And they held that provisions in the Affordable Care Act requiring states to expand their Medicaid rolls or lose all the funding were, quote, an unconstitutional gun to the head. Now, a lot of the rest of the opinion was garbage, but at least on that, they upheld this long-standing tradition that they can't coerce the states like this through funding. Now, as a quick aside, we've got this. This was actually written by a guy at Georgetown Law, Brian Galley. He says, conditional federal spending is a centerpiece of the modern regulatory architecture of the United States. With the exception of Medicare, nearly every big ticket item on the federal government's domestic spending budget goes to support a joint venture with the states. I've talked about this many, many times. States are partners with the federal government on most federal programs. He points out unemployment insurance, aid to the poor, education standards and incentives, clean air and water, health care for the indigent and those with disabilities, and legal protections against state-sponsored discrimination are all designed as a set of conditions on federal grants to states. So that tells us two big things. On the one hand, we know that politicians, federal, state, local, they all love loot. They all love getting pirates' booty. And so this type of thing will likely continue. But on the other hand, this is a slight positive. Again, partnerships don't work too well when half the team quits. And the reason that the feds do this is because they don't have the person power or resources to enforce their so-called laws, regulations, or mandates on their own. So the next time you hear that the feds are just going to yank all federal highway funding or all federal blank funding, you're going to know that it really has to be only a small percentage. It has to be absolutely related. And you know that there are two Supreme Court cases that actually back you up. That's South Dakota versus Dole in 1987 and NFIB versus Sibelius in 2012. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational more than anything. I hope you learned something. I really appreciate you spending some of your time with me today. If you can, please consider helping us spread the word with a few free, easy peasy actions. Smash the like button. Subscribe, get bell notifications on whatever platform you're on, leave a review on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platform. All those things trigger the algorithm of primarily the mainstream platforms you watch or listen on, and it tells that platform to show the program to more people. And of course, if you want to pitch in financially, we absolutely couldn't roll up our sleeves every single day and get the job done without the support and the financial faith of our members. That starts out as little as $2 a month. 10thamendmentcenter.com/members is the URL. You know what to do. Or one-time donation is 10thamendmentcenter.com/donate. Thanks again for joining me here today. I really appreciate you being here. I hope you have a great weekend, and I'll see you next week here on the Path to Liberty.